I'm speaking to you at the Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens, the perfect setting to introduce a conversation that I had with Donald G. Lindburg, one of the most important scientists ever to conduct research on zoo animals. I first met Dr. Lindburg at the University of California, Davis, when he was on the faculty and I was a student. This was a long time ago. Well, Don did very important work with a variety of zoo animals, including gorillas, cheetahs, and giant pandas, among others. He's one of the most respected primatologists in the world. So sit back and enjoy this conversation with Don Lindburg, which was recorded in 2014. Don, thanks for sitting down with me today.
It's a pleasure.
As you know, I interviewed Heine Hediger, who is a hero for both of us, and the tradition was set that we enjoy a bottle of wine during the interview, of course. So
I'm following in a wonderful tradition, I think, not only for the wine, but Heine.
Yes, indeed, and he enjoyed it. This is a nice bottle of Pinot Noir.
Great.
Good California wine. Hope we don't spill any of it on us. So, with that, thank you again.
You're welcome.
You know, you and I have kicked around the zoo business for quite a long time, and we're both former academics. In your case, you left a tenured position at UCLA
Right.
and came to the zoo world, and a lot of people must have wondered how you could make a decision like that. What went into the process of making that change?
There were a couple of factors involved in leaving a safe position in academia to go into a zoo, which in those days, zoos were not known to be great centers of research. But there was a very charismatic person in San Diego named Kurt Benerschke. He was a pathologist by training, but he got involved in doing chromosome analysis of a wide variety of mammals and got inspired to think about conservation. Before I came on the scene, he had already hired Dr. Oliver Ryder to come in as geneticist and Dr. Bill Lasley as a reproductive physiologist. And I had met Bill during my years when I was on the faculty at UC Davis, so I knew from that hiring that there had to be something really solid about all of this. Even so, I wavered. The zoo doesn't know to this day that I took a year's leave of absence from UCLA to go down there and spend a year with them and try to figure it out. Do I want to do this? And they furthermore don't know that I took a second year's leave of absence.
Case.
Right, never told the zoo about this. They thought they had hired me. So it would have been quite a shock to them if I had pulled out after 2 years, but it really looked better and better all the time. But here is a very practical factor in this, Terry. I had no research animals at UCLA. I had looked into it, and I found they were not going to build a facility or stock it with primates and the labor of caring for them. No way. So the only way I could continue my academic career was to go back to India, where I had done my dissertation research, and keep studying wild populations. And although that was a wonderful experience, I really didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. So it was a practical matter of going to the zoo where there are all kinds of animals.
Did you find that you could pick and choose what you wanted, or were there particular things you wanted to study there?
At the time that I arrived, I will never forget my very first meeting with the higher-ups in the zoo. And there was a very streetwise director of collections, whom I think you knew, James Dolan.
Right.
And it was my first meeting with him and the director and other people, and he said, "You're just here. You will revive the cheetah project." Cheetahs? I was totally unfamiliar with cheetahs. I'm not sure I'd even seen one before, but there was a certain amount of preliminary analysis to do, and the first thing I discovered was that all of their cheetahs on hand were almost ready to die. So it was a bigger challenge than I thought it would be, but they had asked for it, so I sent them to Bill every time I wanted to build another cage or go to Africa and bring home some cheetahs.
I know, being a primatologist, that was where your background was, but you did a lot of things with cats. And with the cheetahs, I recall you did something that reminded me of Markowitz to activate those guys.
Right.
That was pretty cool. How did you do that?
There was a need when I arrived there and looked over the cheetah population to attack several issues. First of all, a cheetah scholar named Dr. Tim Caro had come down from UC Davis. He had just been in the field, and he looked at the cheetahs and he says, "They are so fat." And I said, "Really?" And so the wheels started turning in my mind. It just so happened that about this time, a person who was into training greyhounds for racing came to the park where I was stationed, and and he said, I'll bet you they would chase a lure just like the greyhounds do. And I thought, well, perhaps he is right. So of course, they just couldn't resist going after something that was zipping by them. And this was all on a pretty strong nylon cord strung around cables, and it made a great big half-acre loop, or something like that. And it was irresistible to them, so it was so easy to do this. And fortunately, it caught on. One of the highlights of that was when the Discovery Channel knocked on my door and said, "Hey, we've been hearing about this thing you're doing with the cheetahs," and they made a little show. So that was my first exposure to the movies, I guess.
Well, one of the things you did that was interesting is that you fed a carcass of an animal to cats, and that turned out to be kind of an innovation, didn't it?
Yes, it was. Zoos had a big freezer, and for the carnivores in their collection, ground hamburger. An interesting thing developed with the cheetah, and that is that on this diet, the lower teeth started eroding the palate at the corners, and it would go so far as to puncture the cheetah's palate. So particles of food would crawl right up work into the nostrils, and lo and behold, I remember very clearly, I wanted to get a female one day and put her in the breeding, and she's sick. What's wrong? She's got her nose is infected. Nobody knew that this was a factor, and so that's why we got away from soft food, because carnivores gnaw on the bones, and they need that. That's the exercise that their jaws and teeth get that keeps them healthy.
You're one of the people that has partnered with vets. How do you feel about that, where they're going with it and where it's going next?
It is absolutely essential. If you do not have them on your side as a scientist, there are so many ways that they can just casually not cooperate. On the other hand, if you show them some respect, as I did, by saying, "Hey, I know you make morning rounds. Could I go along with you and see what you're doing, checking those animals out every morning?" They loved it. It recognized them. I used to say they all have very big egos with that DVM, but it was not, well, it was just a simple way for me to learn what they did and how they regarded their work, and it went a long way as far as my reputation in the zoo world was concerned and my relationship with veterinarians.
One of the things we deal with in academia is publish or perish, and in San Diego, I would imagine, unlike a lot of zoos, publishing was important. How did they reward and guide their scientists?
I really don't think that there was any system for encouraging scientists like me on a zoo staff to publish. I did it out of my own self-interest and my survival as a scientist, and they liked the results they saw. I would get invited to lectures. I would have opportunities to be interviewed by the local media, great stories to tell, and so you sort of have to create it.
Yeah.
But I found a receptive audience.
Good. Primate-wise, one of the projects you worked on that was pretty famous at the time was the lion-tailed macaque. Can you review a little bit of that? And the other thing is, I get the impression macaques aren't doing so well in zoos, and I'm wondering why.
Along the way, I had inherited from you, Terry, the editorship of the journal Zoo Biology, and I started writing editorials. And one that I wrote was, quote, "Macaques do not have a bright future in North American zoos." I was predicting their demise, and the thing that was shocking about it was that it happened so much sooner than I expected it to. But here's the thing about macaques. Virtually all of these macaques carried a certain virus called herpes B. It did not affect them. But if you tested your group, every one of them would be carrying it. And the kicker in this is if that virus gets transmitted to a human, it is fatal to humans. There were people in my zoo who got real red-faced about this and says, "I'm never going to go close to one of your macaques. I don't want to get that virus and die." And of course, they didn't realize that we weren't like laboratories where these fatalities were occurring. In the lab, you get sprayed with their urine, you break some glassware, you get a little cut, and that is such a different scene than occurs in the zoo, where the closest you get to them in interacting is to hose out their enclosures, clean it, things of that nature. Otherwise, you're just watching them. So it took a long time for that message to get out. Unfortunately, the damage was done, and macaques became very rare in zoos. I think there are only a couple that have Japanese macaques today, and there's probably zero chance of their ever making a comeback.
Now, you mentioned zoo biology, and of course you served as editor. Was there any other editorial you wrote that was a particularly hard-hitting one that you remember?
It was zoos and the surplus problem. When you embrace genetic management, you find that in your own existing population, there's the possibility that a certain male had sired all of the rest of the animals except his female mates. And it's called founder effect. Well, you can't sustain a population genetically if there are people having a more than their share, so to speak, of the mating. And so this was very important for zoos to realize. This particular editorial was the only one that I wrote that was ever picked up and translated into a foreign language. It was done by the Ueno Zoo in Tokyo. And they thought it was really right on for them. And, that helped in Southeast Asia to get the word out.
The fact that we had a journal, I always thought it would stimulate research. Did you have a sense that happened, that zoo biology itself, by its existence, was generating more interest in doing research around the country?
I have to give a qualified answer. The subject matter is there. And what I think needs to be added is a mechanism for people who pick up the journal and read this article and say, "I don't believe that," and they want to say something. Well, if the journal is structured such that that is welcomed, it can happen. I've been too far removed from this now for several years to know whether anything like that exists. But I think, there are good models out there. Current Anthropology was a journal that I encountered as a grad student, and this is precisely what the editor of that journal did. He would take a manuscript and send it out to 5 or 6 people and say to each one of them, what do you think of this? Write an essay. And then it would come back, and the original author would read all these, and then he would write his response to it. It was a very good process.
And of course, you had a long career in primatology. You were, in fact, ASP's distinguished primatologist a few years ago, so you've had a long and important career. But in the zoo world, you're best known for pandas.
Mm-hmm.
And when you got started in pandas, there were a lot of things wrong about the panda program. There was a great need for change. What was the thing that excited you most about working with giant pandas?
The excitement in working with giant pandas arose in large part because no one knew anything about them. And yet, when you looked at it from a conservation standpoint, this is a species that was in dire need of some help if they're going to survive. It's probably not widely known that there are only about 1,600 pandas living in the wild state today. So when we started out with the pair that was sent to the San Diego Zoo in 1996, we didn't know what we were doing because no one knew what to do. The species was, oh yes, it's a bear, but it's a different kind of bear. It only eats bamboo. And so I can remember setting up weekly meetings of staff, and we would take reports from anybody, everybody, keepers, curators, and so on, could say what they wanted. Curators didn't like this, at that time at least, because they felt it was a huge infringement on their turf. And I remember one curator who came to all the meetings, but he sat there looking rather glum. So I would call on him, and I would say, what do you think about that? And you know, he would answer, and it just sort of defanged him a little bit, I guess you could say. And so the process worked. But it was absolutely essential that we do this because we were still feeling our way. Is what are the needs of this species? How do we keep them alive, more than alive? How do we keep them happy? And how do we get them started to breeding?
And I do recall, because we were aspiring to get pandas ourselves, we kind of approached it from a Harlovian perspective, that, pandas were not raising their babies. So I thought maybe that was part of the problem they had growing up to be mothers. Do you think that was true?
I think one should bear in mind as well that we were dealing with a species that was virtually unknown to the American public, but at the same time was pretty darn cute. Yeah. And this is why, when finally we got a female pregnant and had the first panda birth in the United States to lead to a cub growing up, it became such a sensation.
Yeah.
And I was still the spokesperson for that program, and I had, for the next 5 years, I averaged about 50 media contacts as this little panda was growing up. Wow. Including major outlets like Good Morning America, the Today Show, and any number of others from around the world. A newspaper in Hong Kong, for example, contacted me and wanted a story. Society in this country was really, you know the expression, going ape?
Yeah.
They were going panda over pandas.
Yeah, we call it pandemonium.
Pandemonium, yeah.
Don, of course you worked in China and worked along with the Chinese scientists. Today, they're still doing a lot of AI. There are things they do in China, not to be critical, but I worry about, at one time we had few pandas, and now maybe we've got too many pandas living in poor institutions that don't have the right facilities for these animals. And so you're turning it into a welfare problem by success in breeding.
China has adopted a policy of weaning their cubs at 6 months of age. I'm sure you know that the natural weaning age is 18 to 24 months. This has the big payoff in that mothers begin to cycle every year. So they're doubling their output by doing this. Is there a penalty? I'm watching this, but it's going to take people who are much closer to the situation. What I'm hearing in the background is that quite a number of males that have been shipped out to zoos in the West are having to fall back on artificial insemination. So it raises the question of whether this shortened period of dependency on the mother affects the breeding capacity as adults. Of course, they're not sitting there going to school and learning exactly how they're supposed to do it when they grow up, but we can't be sure of all the benefits of this continued interaction between a mother and her offspring. So it's just something that I put out there to say, pay attention.
The fact that we work in zoos, one of the opportunities we have is to look at the field as a model or an influence over what we do in zoos. Have you always seen it that way?
I had a postdoc who was looking for something to do. So I said, well, you're going to China for 6 months, you're going to Wolong, and you're going to develop your own studies. And he came back with 3 papers, all of which were published in Animal Behavior, which, as you know, is the top journal for behavioral work in our country. One thing that intrigued me was that he noticed, of course, as anyone will who watches pandas for a while, that they scent mark a lot. Both sexes have this huge scent gland under their tail, and they'll back up to a tree or a rock, and they'll go in this kind of circular movement, and they're leaving their scent. And he, of course, noticed that in some males, they would do handstands, elevate that gland as high as they could get it, and rub it, while they're standing on their hands. And so he did an experiment in a captive situation. He experimented with how much attention females paid to scent signals from males at different levels above ground. And you probably can guess that they like the high ones the best. It probably said to them, this is good quality male, he can stand up there, Sounds perhaps oversimplistic, but something really true was going on there. And this is what I mean by, having these good young scholars going out there and seeing opportunities that are totally harmless, yet pay off in an important way in terms of the knowledge that they generate.
I have always believed that the zoo world would benefit from more programs of research. Who are the chief institutions that have that kind of program, would you say?
I think 2 of the topmost right now are, of course, San Diego and Zoo Atlanta, but there are good programs at the Bronx. There are a few other zoos, Seattle, to name another one. I don't mean to slight anybody, but I can think of those for the United States. But we should not forget that places like Germany and Copenhagen and even Brazil have some remarkably good animal facilities and remarkably good scientific programs that are also training programs. So there's a model out there, that can be pursued to great effect. Perhaps we just need a little more enthusiasm for it, a little more vision.
Well, I remember having some collaborations with the National Zoo because they had so many wide-ranging programs when Deborah Kleiman was there and Ben Beck. They've kind of lost some of those top scientists. But it probably helped them to have the federal government behind them a little bit more resources than most of us have. It was interesting, though, when they were the only zoo that had pandas, and then all of a sudden there are other zoos that I think helped pandas to have more zoos that could work on it with them.
The importance of having a species like the panda in several zoos around the country, I think is straightforward. If we go back and look at the history, in the 1970s, pandas were free. China was presenting them to Western zoos so that Madrid and Paris and London, Mexico City, the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., got them as gifts. Unfortunately, they were not very good stewards in those days, and that total population died out.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder what it would be like now if this had been a sustained population. They wouldn't belong to China. They would belong to us.
Right. It would have been different, yeah.
It would have made a lot of difference, because I think, you know, one of the biggest problems we continue to have to deal with consists of the limits that are imposed by the owners of the animals. It's unlike any other animals in our collection, you know. They belong, in a sense, to the local institution. You can trade them to another zoo, but not pandas. There will always only be pairs of pandas in 4 U.S. zoos, the same 4 U.S. zoos, and they will be totally under, not totally, but you know, largely under control as far as what we can do with them. It may not be realized that today it is not possible to collect semen from a male in San Diego and send it to Atlanta if it should be needed. That is not allowed. So there are a number of restrictions like this that do limit us. But I think we're doing pretty well anyway.
Well, yes, I think it's been a great success. I know that there was a lot of criticism about the program when it started, especially from Europe. But I think by any measure, you'd have to say, even with those limitations, it has been very successful. And the publications that have come out of it, I mean, it's enormous, the productivity that has occurred. Now, one of the reasons that has happened is, and you pioneered this, the cooperation with field people like WWF when you did that book.
At that time, the World Wildlife Fund did not have tremendously high respect for zoos. But I, again, looked at this issue. The big issue is we don't know much about the species. Surely there are a lot of Chinese workers who have written, published in their own language. We don't know about it. So it was kind of like an epiphany. Let's have this big conference. And so we named it Panda 2000, Conservation Priorities for the New Millennium. And I knew that we couldn't get anywhere if it was just a San Diego Zoo project. So we invited World Wildlife Fund to be co-partners in this. And they loved the idea. And to move forward, to summarize this, we had over 50 scholars, Chinese scholars, attend that meeting. We had simultaneous translation of their talks into English. And then, of course, we had the book that came out of this, Giant Pandas, Biology and Conservation. So it was a huge insight, or an increased awareness might be a better way of putting it, that good science was going on in China and none of us knew anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, those conferences are really important. Now, another one you participated in was Ethics on the Ark.
Yes.
That we put together in Atlanta.
Yes.
And that was one of the first times that the zoo world encountered their critics. The whole idea of putting it together was to have common ground on issues where it was possible. So we had to let in the door some of the people that had been our most vehement critics. How did you find that conference? And you had a pretty important role in the subject you tackled.
Well, I think you bring up a very good point that there is conflict within different research entities. For example, conservation organizations who, like, let's say the Audubon Society, for example, that have their own programs, and they don't think zoos have anything to say. They're still just exhibiting and entertaining people. The stereotype persists, I believe, to an unfortunate degree. Where we've tried it, it seems to me it has worked very, very well. So why don't we do more of that kind of thing?
Well, what happened, because Audubon actually opposed the program with condors, didn't they, in the early stages of it?
Yes.
But they eventually accepted it.
They did. Yes, you mentioned the California condor, which in 1989 was actually extinct in the wild. Over that winter, they knew they had only one male and 4 females left in the wild. And so the decision was made to catch what's left and bring them in. So technically, there was not a single California condor in the wild state. They were extinct in the wild. Against the predictions of powerful people. So it was a matter of moving against the odds and the critics and setting up captive breeding facilities. 2 zoos led the way. The zoo in Los Angeles and the zoo in San Diego. And they've made these huge condor pens, and they flourished in there. In fact, I was thinking about this quite recently, and I came to the conclusion that in captivity was safer for them than the wild. Because you know what happens in the wild? Hunters are careless with their shooting, and lead from the carcasses they kill will get left behind. Quite a few condors were coming in and dying because they were dying of lead poisoning. Or how about the power lines that go across our country? They didn't know they shouldn't land on those towers and electrocute themselves. So, you could really make the case that it was a pretty dangerous world out there. But of course, today, we're seeing the marvelous success of that effort. I would say one additional point here, and that is that having it going on in captivity created tremendous media awareness. There are condors soaring over the Tehachapis. There are condors soaring over Baja California. There are condors soaring over the Grand Canyon. No one even thinks about the possibility that they will go extinct today.
But Don, one of the things you did, of course, so well was to be the editor of Zoo Biology for 10 years. You were a great steward of the journal, changed the journal, advanced it. And but you had to take a lot of time away from your work as a scientist to be the editor. And how did it benefit you? How did you feel about being the editor of the journal?
I felt terrific. To sum it up, it did several things. It gave me higher standing with my own institution. It gave me a feeling of propagating the conservation message, which had become so important and still is, through an effective format. And the mention of using up time away from other things like doing my own research, it was not as great as one might think. I would say to young scientists, you will find the excitement and the sense of accomplishment far outweighs any detractions from you doing your scientific work. It really is important to be a conservationist while you are a scientist, if in fact that is where your heart lies. And in zoos, I think that's particularly important.
The many people that have had big effect in some zoos anyway are the postdocs. Did you have postdocs at San Diego?
We did. and they still do have them. Postdocs are very good because they commit to, usually it's a 3-year period, and they either go at the end to another job, or once in a while they've worked out so well that you decide you want to keep them as permanent staff.
Yeah.
I had a zoo, I had a boss who had postdocs, as I had postdocs. And he announced at staff meeting, it was an ironclad rule, that when the 3 years is up, that person goes. Well, when the first one of his came up, he got a staff appointment. I was in his office the next day. And I said, we can all play this game. I have a certain person that's very good too. And it actually turned out to be probably one of the best panda scientists we have anywhere in the country, if not the world.
Well, the welfare thing that we've been talking about, has many dimensions. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is the role of a zookeeper. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about that. And I'm wondering if our zookeepers are doing the work they should be doing there. It seems like the job could be more useful and maybe more inspiring for them if it was designed a little differently. If you had a chance to redesign what zookeepers do, how would you do it?
Well, if I had that opportunity today to define the role of keepers, I would recognize, first of all, that if you do not have competent keepers, you're not going anywhere. They're right there, the immediate contact between the researcher and the kind of care that their animals are getting, their availability for your programs, and so on. But there is another aspect to this. I can say this because I did it myself, and that is to have keeper training programs. And first of all, I found that keepers loved it. They welcomed the opportunity to learn more about what was expected of them in their role. So, that worked very well from the standpoint of researcher and keeper. But I think there's also something else here that could be employed as a mechanism to make that program stronger. And that is to have things like this come up in institutional zoos accreditation process. What did you do to improve the quality of keepers in your institution? Proof, please, to what you did. So these mechanisms, I don't know if they're used, but they could be, and I think it would make the keeper profession even more valuable than it is.
Would you ask those keepers to spend X amount of time every day just watching those animals? Or so often they come in, they clean them, they go off and do something else, but just taking a look at them every day, see what they're doing.
Well, that's a very good point, Terry, because I think if they don't know their animals, they're not going to give them the best possible care. And how do you get to know them unless you watch them and what they do? Yeah. So it's a very good point. I agree with it.
We had very strong ties in Atlanta to our universities. Did San Diego Zoo make that connection, or maybe did the university recognize that connection as well as they might have?
Connections with universities were more the other way. That is, that a professor would call me up and say, I have this really bright student who loves zoos and conservation, and she would like to do a project.
Yeah.
I can give you an example. I hope my memory doesn't fade me here, but this young lady named Amy Smith came as a person to work with me, and I'm very much into organoleptic factors as far as welfare of zoo animals is concerned. And that means, what does their food feel like, taste like, smell like, look like, what's its texture, and so on. So I put her on a project where we had a group of lion-tailed macaques with a steep dominance hierarchy. The point we wanted to test was, is it better, therefore, to give them whole foods or chopped foods? I was looking at all of the kitchens around the zoo where every morning keepers spent hours preparing meals for these animals, and I wondered, why can't you let monkeys pull the husks off themselves or the peelings off themselves? Oh, but then there'll be this dominance, subordinates kind of issue come to play, and some will be left out. We had 5 parameters to measure this, and every one of them said the whole food approach had the biggest payoff.
Wow.
Because it is true, the dominance, as I said a moment ago, will grab several pieces and crawl up the wall or on a perch and sit there. But they'll take a bite out of an orange and then drop it. And a little subordinate down there runs over and grabs it, and gets its shot at it. The main point that I remember is that all members of the hierarchy got access to a greater variety of food when it was whole than when it was chopped. It's counterintuitive. You would not have thought that, but that's the way it worked out.
Well, Heidegger always said, or he said it frequently and wrote it, that science is always last in the zoological garden. I asked him about that. He had an opinion on it, expanded on it, but I've also found that science is often resisted by staff. And you must have encountered some of that. Why do you think that is, that science and scientists often have a hard time moving into the zoo structure?
Well, I would not say that it's true everywhere, for one thing. But it is a factor. The point I guess I'm trying to make is that I don't buy it that every zoo must have a research program. There are ways you can participate in research programs at institutions that can afford them, by sharing samples, by going over and helping in the lab, or taking, getting on the calendar to watch the animals. So if you're a behaviorist for a day a week or something like that, and of course, you do interreliability testing and you know what you've got there. So there are lots of possibilities.
Yeah, Don, why have there been so many difficulties breeding pandas?
When I hear someone say that pandas are notoriously inept at breeding, as Time magazine did maybe 2-3 weeks ago, I respond by saying that's not true. They do breed well. They just look clumsy and inept. You have to bear in mind that the male's organ is very short. And the female's organ is covered by a tail flap. They have to work with what they've got, and I can't explain why that's what they have, but in any case, give them time, and they will pull it off. So, we can't listen to the popular media for our answers, so that's the way I see it. They do breed very well.
In the zoo world, one of the most difficult things in recent years has been building populations of big animals that bred successfully and live successfully. Some people have said that the elephant cannot live in captivity successfully, and there have been a series of problems with elephants. What's the answer in the zoo world to creatures like that?
Well, there are no easy answers to things of this nature, but I think the seriousness of the problem demands that we find them. Elephants are being slaughtered at a terrible rate in the wild today. and it's all to support the ivory trade. That's unfortunate. And there's not much we can do about that. But we can do the best possible job, I think, with these large pachyderms in our zoos. But when I was editor of zoo biology, I remember reading accounts of a zoo in Toronto where in the winter they had to go out and break the ice so that the elephants could gain access to the water. I saw this firsthand at a zoo in Ohio. What a cold weather zoo has to do with tropical animals. Pen them up inside, and they're just lying there on cement benches like this. No exercise, nothing to interact with. And I thought, oh, this is just so unfortunate that you have something like this. There is an answer. The majority of people listening to us talk will not have heard of the Arnhem Zoo. I believe that's in the Netherlands.
Yes, it is.
The Arnhem Zoo has solved this problem in a beautiful way. They've enclosed their entire zoo under some kind of roofing, and you'll find the resources are there, I think, if you propose something like that. I am really surprised that the Arnhem model has not spread to other places. It is so practical, so sensible, solves a huge problem.
I have noticed too that with elephants, because they're a high priority animal, we're doing more. But an animal like the hippopotamus, which also likes to be out at night, almost never gets to go out at night.
True.
They don't seem to be as important, but in the welfare sense, we ought to be thinking more about them as well.
The hippopotamus is one more example of a large-sized animal that requires a superhuman effort in terms of their welfare. So building these big pools is expensive. Furthermore, if you've ever had one where you could see what's going on underwater, when a hippopotamus defecates, you know, the tail scatters the feces into fine little particles that float around and eventually settle. So just the filtering of the water itself is a big ticket item. But I think there's also another important point here, and that is when zoos attempt, as they should, to follow genetic guidelines. And that means they have to capture and ship some of these big animals from point A to point B. When there were accidents, animals died in shipping, and of course, there's quite a cost to crating up a big animal like this.
A lot of people are saying, the field people, you can't move elephants around and form false herds because normally they live in a matriarchy of related animals.
Yes.
One of the big challenges, I suppose, is creating herds because we don't have families. We're not bringing families over.
Right.
Orcas, elephants, other animals.
That's true.
Behaviors, it almost has to be involved in that.
Often it doesn't have anything to do with there being a big animal, but it has to do with certain tendencies of species to be highly xenophobic. I remember cringing one day when it was recommended that a certain female lion-tailed macaque be crated up and sent to another zoo. And we argued this point vigorously, and my bottom line was, you're sending this animal to certain death. A female trying to penetrate the rigid social structure of an organized group doesn't stand a chance. So we ended up saying, we're looking at the wrong sex.
Yeah.
Move males around.
And
we even had a publication come out of all of that. And I think zoos have learned from these kinds of experiences, and that I assume that's what happens today. The males, they can defend themselves, and that they're taking their genes into a new gene pool. The effect is the same.
You know, the whole purpose of all this is to get inside the head of somebody who's been there. Tell me how you feel about, you spent 27 years at the San Diego Zoo, and looking back on it, You must feel pretty good about it.
I will say, Terry, that deciding to leave my tenured position at a major university and join the research staff of a very first-rate zoo was the smartest decision I ever made. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was also stimulating, and I got very widely educated on the conservation issues that I otherwise would not have had access to. So it was pretty good.